Well, thank you, everybody. I'm really honored to have this book launch today. This is our US book launch. And my name is Nidhi Trehan. I'm an affiliated senior research fellow at the Central European University's Romani Studies program. And I want to welcome all our guests and panelists on this book launch. And this is something we've been working on for quite some time. And this has been hosted during this very difficult time of COVID, actually, by Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung of Washington, D.C. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. So the Heinrich-Böll Foundation is a nonprofit organization that is part of the global green movement. It advances political and socioeconomic transformations through civic engagement and political dialogue. The Washington, D.C. office, in line with the foundation's guiding principles and values, works to strengthen civil liberties, human rights, and democratic institutions. It promotes gender equality, social justice, and equity, and strives to preserve a habitable planet for current and future generations. So I really wanted to thank all the folks here today who have joined me. And I am going to just say a couple of words about our book overall. So many of those on the panel we're familiar with social justice issues, particularly what has been happening to the Romani communities in the last several decades since the transition from socialism, communism to what we have today, which is sort of a hybrid form of capitalism. Many folks call it neoliberal capitalism. And there have been many challenges, socioeconomic challenges that Romani communities have faced, not to mention the continuing, endemic racism, which has been, historically rooted, for many centuries. And many people, many commentators have called it a kind of, historical humiliation of Romani communities being written out, being invisibilized. And these issues are something I think our book is raising once again. In a fresh way, when we look at some of the contributors, and I would like to just quickly mention some of the other contributors on the book who've contributed. Many of these folks have been involved in Romani social justice issues for a long time and have worked with institutions that have been built up in the last 20 years, 30 years almost, in Central and Eastern Europe primarily. And some of these folks I'm just going to mention. So apart from my co-editors here, we have Roland Ferkovic and Marek Silvashi, and both of them have contributed to the chapter on New Social Europe. And Bernard Rorka worked with the European Roma Rights Center for many years, and he has written an excellent case study on the Gyöngyöspáta violence in Gyöngyöspáta in Hungary. And then we also have Katalin Rostas, who did a fine interview with Jenő, Setet Jenő, who is one of the leading activists today in Hungary, who is calling for social justice and reform. And many of you are familiar with what's happening right now in Hungary. It's a kind of authoritarian, illiberal form of so-called democracy. I say that because Hungary is part of the European Union, and yet there have been many abrogations of democracy, many changes which Orban himself has wrought. So these are all very interesting issues which are raised in the book. Now, I just want to say very quickly that for us, when we were going through the book, and by the way, I want to mention a couple of more authors really quickly. So we have a youth chapter. This is Anna Darozzi, Lisa Smith, and Sarah Semlin, who have contributed to our youth chapter. And then finally, another panelist, another contributor who's not on our panel today, Angela Kotze has been instrumental actually in the last couple of decades in bringing to the fore issues of Romani feminism and intersectionality. And she's the director of the CEU's Romani Studies program. So this was like an overview quickly of the book. And now I'm just going to mention a few things that I wanted to just suggest to you to reflect on. So one is, of course, that the US elections recently, with Biden-Harris's victory, means that there's going to be a heightened emphasis on human rights, both in the United States and globally. So this is definitely an opportunity to raise all these critical issues that activists have been working on, including non-discrimination, anti-racism, fundamental police reform in this country, recognition of Romani Americans as an ethnic group. And all these really important issues are raised in our book. And I want to just now I will quickly shift to the panel. And I would like to introduce, first of all, Andrew. He's associate professor at the Institute of Communication and Sociology, Corvinus, University of Budapest, and board member of the Roma Education Fund. Thank you, Andrew, and please take it from here. Hello, Andrew.
Unmute the mic.
Hello, I've unmuted myself. Okay, hi everybody. Good to be here. I think a key point I want to make is we raced to write this book. The nature of policy press shorts is there's a very short time from when the author's finished writing to when the book is published. The aim is to get something out to the public at an important moment in time. And when we were planning this book, we thought, okay, good. We'll have it published and it will feed into debates about new policies in Europe for Roma. But I don't think we imagined the book would come out during the time it has, with a pandemic, with a president in America who doesn't seem to want to leave the White House, which is creating something of a constitutional crisis. What a world we live in. And as we were writing the book during the pandemic, it became more and more clear to us that we are living in a moment of critical importance. And we hope this book might be an instrument that our people, the social movement that promotes Roma rights, can use in its work. And one of the key things that we wanted to do was to bring in the term social Europe into the narrative of Roma activism. What is social Europe? It's a concept that was developed in the 70s and 80s. This is a time, of course, in which the world was making a choice about what direction it wanted to go in. And it seems that with the Washington Consensus, most of the world decided to take a neoliberal turn. Social Europe was being developed as an alternative. Social Europe is a Europe where there is a focus on social justice, redistribution, and intervention. Unfortunately, it didn't gather a great deal of momentum. If anything, progressive centre-left politics went down the route of third way politics where neoliberalism was accepted and embraced. We're saying now is the time to take a new turn. Let's use this term social Europe, not just to address obviously Roma inequality, but in environmental problems, the gap between rich and poor created by austerity, and of course the growing xenophobia and racism in Europe. We want to add to the concept of social Europe thought and thinking on the issue of race, which wasn't there before. We feel the concept was lacking something. And in this book, we've tried to marry, if you like, campaign aims of redistribution and intervention with racial justice. We believe racial justice and social justice are two of the same thing. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And I would just like to now introduce my other co-editor who is here today, Marius. Marius, thank you so much for joining us from the UK. And he's a visiting lecturer and fellow at Corvinus University of Budapest and former grants and research manager at the Roma Education Fund. But also Marius has been one of the very few people who's been following the movement for decades. And he has a wealth of information to share with us. Thank you, Marius.
Thank you, Nidhi. Hello to all the panelists and special greetings to Böll-Stiftung Foundation for supporting us in putting this event together. It seems that today I will have to start with a parenthesis because of the terminology that I use it in my chapter. So my chapter, it's called Anti-Gypsies in the Time of Neoliberalism, Challenging the Radical Right to Transformative Change. I know that a lot of critics looking at the etymology of the term anti-Gypsies, and from the lessons of political correctness, I have to mention this, that indeed the term, how it's embedded into the institutional vernacular and into the policy documents that are used by the Council of Europe, which first try to have a definition of what it's called anti-Gypsies. Then little by little, the term, it's getting more terrain in the European Union agenda, and not the last into the academia. I have to confess that I would prefer the term anti-Roma races instead of anti-Gypsies. But in this specific chapter, I use the institutional term, the what it's called lingua franca into the policy development at the last years, and in this specific momentum of transformations and reflection. However, the term anti-Gypsies, it's not new, and we dig historically and look that actually it has been used in the former Soviet Union space roughly 100 years ago. But why we choose today to have not redefinition, not an exhaustive linguistic and political correctness of a term, but rather to reflect in a longitudinal way of a social, political, and economic transformation that our society are facing in the last decade. And I am thinking here, the race of neoliberalism, the race of illiberalism, and the race of extreme right political parties, both in Eastern European level and in a Western European countries. I am thinking here of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, as well the Netherlands of Wilders, as well Sarkozy in France, and Italian territories. So when we talk about boosting of a radical right, we cannot do the old separation of Eastern versus Western society. The second point of analysis, we look at the historical terms and what are the social, economic, and political events that actually it's creating kind of an environment that the anti-Roma racism it's boosting. And we went back and we used the work of Karl Polanyi describing how the authoritarian regimes could come after the crisis and during the war. Then we look at the concept of economics, because many people say that the market and neoliberalism principle of laissez-faire, laissez-passer, it doesn't affect the races. But actually looking at the work of Peter Tame and the most recently work of Thomas Piketty, we learn that the market, it's not a mechanism that it doesn't discriminate, and it's actually backed by ideology, and it's sometimes pushing Roma in what it's called the dual economy. Yeah, they are pushed the economy, the racial part of economy, it's pushing the people from different racial background, ethnicity, in what it's called unproductive part or dual economy concept. We look also at the race of radical movement and parties, and here we look at the work of Kasmude, which in principle he is determining that anti-Gypsies and the radical movement against minority in the Eastern Europe, it's somehow, on his opinion, higher than in the Western. But when we dig and we took specifically Roma, we actually identify case studies that somehow when it's about specific form of anti-Gypsies, there are very few differences between the Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And here I would close by saying myself that if a decade ago I wouldn't have money, but I would have where to fly, and I would choose to fly to Western Europe, maybe America. Today I have the money to buy a ticket, and I'm wondering where to fly. America, it's radicalized. Western Europe, it's also not a safe space for Roma. And this is one of the reasons we have to reflect of the conditions that it's boosting the anti-Roma racism, or what it's called in the institutional language, anti-Gypsies, rather than going to its linguistic and its etymological root as being a word, a bad word. So to me, in this analysis, it's important to look more at the processes and to identify the so-called risks or signs that will boost the anti-Gypsies, rather than having debate how political correct it is to say anti-Roma, racist, or anti-Gypsies. So our analysis, it's more the context rather than a very academic part to look at the concept. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hear from the people their opinion.
Thank you, Marius. I just want to add that, you know, what you mentioned about this challenge to neoliberalism. So part of, you know, the issue was that Orbanism has combined neoliberalism with this illiberal authoritarianism. And that has actually split in Hungary, you know, at some level, the Romani political mobilization, because you have Lungodrom, you know, which is part of the illiberal faction. And then, you know, you have, of course, the activists like Yenu Shetet, and, you know, there was Aladar. Aladar, of course, is one of the senior activists who has been organizing for 30 years and was one of the mentors for Yenu. So you have that split within, you know, I should say, you know, Romani political empowerment in a way. So that will be something we can discuss later. But I do want to now move back to North America, and I want to welcome my dear friend Lela Savic. She's the founding editor of La Converse. She has worked also at the Journal Metro in Montreal, covering politics and human rights with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative show Enquête, La Presse, and regularly presents lectures on biases and positionality in the media in Canada, the US, and Europe. She's also the Quebec chapter lead of the Canadian Journalists of Color And she holds a bachelor's degree in communications and psychology from Concordia, as well as a certificate in journalism from the University of Montreal. And the misrepresentation of her people in the mainstream media is what has pushed her to the world of journalism. So Lela, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm blushing. I thought that there are a few points that I'd like to follow up on, especially on what Marius said, but I thought that this book, for one, was very interesting, and finally, you know, getting to the bulk of what's going on in our communities, particularly the chapter in America where Magda spoke about, you know, the leadership and the power structures, which I think are not very often addressed. You know, how many times what's happening in Roma civil society is that we are at a stage where we are still seeking for gradual approbation. And I think that, you know, coming from someone from like a North American expertise, well, I mean, looking at it from a critical race theory, you know, I'm often very astonished at, you know, the level of conversations we're having, especially in Europe. For example, cited one, which really, you know, made me fall off my chair. I was looking at one conference that was called, "Does the EU need the Roma for its recovery?" You know, like having conversation. Like, I was like, can you even imagine if someone were to say, you know, does the EU need Blacks for its recovery? Does the EU need Jewish people for its recovery? Does the EU need Arab people for its recovery? It doesn't make any sense to me. So I think that, like, looking at it from an outside perspective, I'm very astonished at the level of how much, well, first of all, we're so dehumanized, right? That a little bit of humanity from dégagé is almost like a gift to us, right? I'm sorry to say it. So it seems that, like, very often we ourselves contribute to this dehumanization in order to be accepted in certain spaces. And on my end, as I've mentioned in the book, you know, I challenge that very much. And obviously my inspiration comes from, you know, African-American and Native scholars who address this idea of challenging white supremacy, right, rather than upholding it. And what I very often see when we have conversations, even, yes, let's talk about the word anti-Gypsyism, which is rooted in, you know, a word which stems from a racist slur. And so some people are saying, yes, definitely that word is an academic thing. Let's talk about the context. I understand that, but what we need to understand is, as in North America, people use gypsy as a product, like as almost a marketing spice, right? There's gypsy sausages, soaps, name it. You can just Google gypsy on, you know, type it, and you'll see a whole bunch of products that are just extremely dehumanizing. And what happens, those things have consequences because people, for one, mostly in North America, don't understand that Romani people are a race, an oppressed minority, right? And so what happens is that very often when we talk about the Romani people, it is extremely dehumanizing. And so you come to a place where we're invisible, right? And that's, it's very funny, I've said it, I think, as well in a conference previously, is like, it doesn't mean that we cross the ocean, that the racism stops, right? And, but whatever, what happens, I think, in the case of Roma people in America is that we are abandoned, right? Whereas in Europe, there are scholarships for Roma, there are programs, there are conferences, there are things that are happening to encourage Roma, for one, to, you know, stay close to their culture, but for two, to get educated. What happens after that, right? And what I have noticed personally is that through some of my research is that Roma are not more educated in North America than they are in Europe. Actually, it's quite the contrary, you know? And so that's something that I think that we have like big, we're not, it's like the elephant in the room from my end, because when I, you know, go to Europe and I try to address some of these issues, like for me, seeing people who are highly educated with PhDs who are Roma at first was quite shocking, because I grew up in North America where I didn't see that, you know? And so I think that we really need to invest, you know, in the Roma community to try to see how we can create some sort of, you know, relationship building, capacity building, so our communities are emancipated and are not necessarily abandoned. So that's one point I wanted to make. Then there's the question of intersectionality, right? There's different classes. And I think that then again, you know, in terms of Roma activism compared to what's going on in North America and compared to what's going on in Europe, you know, our communities are, I think, not as represented, you know. So those are the things I just wanted to point. I don't know if there's anything else that I could add to the conversation, but for me, really what it is, it's mostly like the misrepresentation in the media, right? I mean, from the shows in TLC and, you know, everything that has to do with gypsies, this has an impact on our communities, especially refugees, Roma refugees from Europe when they come here and they try to seek asylum. I was speaking to some people just this weekend about, you know, a young kid who was telling me that her father was deported, so she had to be put in a foster home. And so she was completely abandoned by the system. And then when she goes into the system trying to explain her history, there is a huge, how can I say, refusal to acknowledge her history when we dehumanize Romani people. And I think that that's what's going on. That's a subject that it's very dear to me, but it's extremely dehumanizing to always have to remind people that we are an ethnic group, that we're not a lifestyle, you know? And this contributes directly to, like, it has a direct effect in the lives of Roma people, Roma refugees who come from Europe and try to seek asylum, try to establish themselves and try to make it, but then they're completely dehumanized. And then there's also the aspect of the, mostly, let's talk about Eastern European refugees who are here in North America, who are still perpetuating the racism. So like I said, the racism doesn't necessarily end, because if my employer is Romanian or Serbian or whatever, I will most probably face discrimination and racism from them as a Roma person. So very often I'm having conversations with people who are, you know, I've been told my entire life, don't tell that you're Roma. I mean, it's pretty visible. But that's a conversation we're having a lot, right? Even some of the people who are darker skinned, who are much more darker than me and much more visible, will not necessarily want to say that they're Roma and will try to erase it so that they fit in. You know, so I think, and that comes from a lack of pride, an internalized hate from being Roma. But how can we be proud to be Roma in North America where we're completely dehumanized? And I think that in Europe, it's somewhat easier to be proud to be Roma because you have representation, you have acknowledgement, right? Getting our Holocaust recognized, we finally got it to be recognized in Canada, but I think it took over 12 years of us asking repeatedly the government to acknowledge this. And we've been facing, I mean, repeatedly, lack of conversation, lack of willingness to hear us out on these things because people just didn't really seem to understand that we're an oppressed minority and that our histories are real. So there's a huge challenge in there. But I will let Magda continue because I'm sure she has a lot more to say about this.
Yeah, and I want to say, Lela, thank you so much for being here and all the work that also Dafina is doing with Romani Pay, because really, if it wasn't for you activists on the ground in Canada, you know, to take these issues forward to the parliament, okay, the recognition of the Romani Holocaust, you know, August 2nd, Memorial Day, Commemoration Day of Roma Holocaust would not have been a reality. And this has been a great victory. So kudos to you guys, really, what you've done in Canada. It's just fantastic in such a short time, really. And, you know, let me just say one thing about this, that since the Holocaust, only 7 entities have recognized the Romani Holocaust, only 7, including EU. I'm including EU in that. And, you know, these are a few countries, of course, Germany, Hungary, Poland is in there too, but very few countries overall, if you look, you know, across Europe. So for example, I don't think Croatia, am I correct on that? I don't think Croatia is recognized. So I am going to now welcome Magda and Margarete Matache. Magda is a contributor also on the book, and she has been an eloquent and impassioned voice for justice for Roma for many decades. She's a scholar from Romania and director of the Roma program at the FXB, which is Francois Javier Bagnot Center for Health and Human Rights. And she's an instructor at Harvard as well. In 2012, she was awarded a Hauser postdoctoral fellowship at the FXB Center, where she went on to found the Harvard's Roma program, which is indeed the first and only Roma program at any Ivy League in the US, or for that matter, any university in the United States. From 2005 to 2012, she was executive director of the Roma Center for Social Intervention and Studies, which is Romani CRIS, one of the premier Romani rights organizations in Europe. And without much further ado, I want to welcome Magda. Thank you so much, Magda.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon for our friends in Europe. Nidhi, I thought that we agreed to only mention my name, not my bad name.
I had to talk about the FXB. It's historical.
Going beyond that, I feel like very triggered to contribute to the conversation, because I feel that both, actually all of them, Andrew, Marius, and Lela, proposed some very interesting topics and conversations. I would just perhaps start with this question, which is related to what they said, and perhaps then move to the chapter. And I would follow up on what on Lela's question: what would it mean for Europe to think about panel conversations, or even to ask this question of does the EU need other people for its recovery? And I would suggest perhaps a question for all of us to think about it, and more so for white Europeans, and that is, does the EU need white Europeans for its recovery? And then when we start from that question, then we can actually understand a little bit better what does it mean to always point out at a minority group, at an oppressed group, being it Roma, LGBT, Black Europeans, or any other group in Europe. So I think that question is as valid as any other question, or perhaps none of these questions is valid. But going beyond that, because I feel like we could talk about this question for hours, but going beyond that, I do want to congratulate Marius, Nidhi, and Andrew for the publication of this book. And I find it particularly interesting, and I'm so grateful that in the book we find the voice of Roma young people and their activism. And I want to honor their voice and their activism by starting with a quote from the book, which comes from Anna Dorothy, one of the Roma youth activists in Europe, and leave it there again for reflection and further conversations, knowing that there is a possibility for the editors to get into a conversation with Roma young people when they launch this book on thinking about youth. So I'll start with Anna's, one of Anna's comments, and she says the following, and I quote: "It is time for white people, men, straight folks, to integrate to the society which is non-white, non-male in majority. As long as we think of ourselves who need to be integrated to messed up societies and systems, we cannot talk about empowerment. If we want transformative change, we cannot seek the one-sided integration of the oppressed into a system which was built to create and maintain inequalities." And I think it is powerful and really speaks about the roots of anti-Roma racism in Europe and the way that it perpetuates through systems, through culture, through education, and so on. But now, I think going back to our chapter, I think that when the editors invited me to contribute to this book, they wanted me to reflect on transatlantic activism and to look at Roma activism on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. But unfortunately, the summer for me, as much, I think that it has been, the whole year has been very busy, as I suppose it has been for all of you. And therefore, Nidhi and I decided to change a little bit the structure of the chapter, and this is why our chapter doesn't look like a conventional chapter, but is more of a conversation. It's a dialogue, it's an interview, which is based on hours and hours of conversations between Nidhi and me, Nidhi and Lela, Nidhi and Dafina. And I think we are all grateful to Nidhi for the way in which she heard our voices, she heard our pain, and then she chose topics to integrate in the chapter. The chapter was much longer at the beginning of this whole process, but we had to cut it down. So what you see at this moment in our chapter are actually questions and invitations for further conversations, provocations, challenges, and also some propositions. So therefore, this chapter doesn't create a path, doesn't suggest a path, but rather reflects on Roma activism and Roma scholarship, and proposes some questions which I think, are important, but are not the only questions out there in thinking about what has been going well in our activism and what can be improved. So Lela talked a little bit about Canada and the work that Dafina Savic, Lela Savic, but also Kakoron Lee, did in the past decades, and I think it's important to honor their accomplishments, especially the recognition of the Roma Holocaust in Canada. This is a huge advocacy success, and I think that Lela is very modest in the way that she talks about all the tactics that they had to employ in actually making sure that there is recognition of the Holocaust. So I do want to honor their work in Canada. But then speaking about Europe and the United States, I think that Nidhi and I had many conversations, and I think that in reading again the chapter, now what I see, although it was not intentional, our chapter, or at least the part on the United States and Europe, really takes an approach that Marshall Ganz uses in his work, and that's really the story of self, the story of us, and the urgency of now. But to that, framework, we also added the stories of non-Roma scholars and activists who are involved in our work. So I think we start with a conversation about my upbringing and the way in which my father and his activism during the 90s influenced my my own beliefs and my own activism, and looking at how anti-Roma violence in the beginning of 90s in a new democratic post-communist Romania really shaped the way in which Roma activism really started in Romania and in Eastern and Central Europe. And perhaps the reason why many of us focused on this idea of human rights, individual human rights, and I think is very much rooted in those experiences, along, of course, with with other developments that were taking place in Europe and other developments that were taking place in the world, including the whole idea of human rights as it was conceptualized after the Second World War. So that's very much at the of the core of our conversation. But then we move on and we talk about Romani Chris and my work at Romani Chris back in the days. And I think it's a reflection and a critique on my own work. So we talk about how important strategic litigation was, how important advocacy work was, but at the same time, how many gaps remain to be filled in the work of Romani Chris and any other NGO in Europe, because we felt, at least in the conversation we needed, that perhaps we didn't put too much attention on community organizing in our work. And I think that that's a critique and perhaps a proposition that I make to the Roma activists in Europe to go beyond NGO work and try to build power in communities. So is this idea of Marshall Ganz to choose between power over versus power with. And this is not an either or proposition, once again. So whenever we talk in this, in this chapter, we don't talk about choosing between advocacy and community organizing, but rather trying to put these concepts together and to, go in both directions at the same time. Then we, going beyond Romani Chris, and I talk about some of our mistakes, I talk about some of our strategies, but going beyond Romani Chris, we look at the larger Roma activism in Europe. And I think that we try to understand why, for instance, we chose to take, if you want, in an American context, an NAACP path, which is the NGO and the advocacy and strategic litigation path, And how do we manage to also take, for instance, a Black Lives Matter movement path, which is a movement of the people, which is a movement that it's a movement of protest, it's a movement of pain. So how do we marry, in the words of Andrew, these two concepts? And we also suggest categories of paths in activism. And I dared in this piece to take, to use the categories of Ibram Kendi from Stem from the Beginning. And Kendi talks about these 3 schools of thought in approaching activism or work with oppressed groups. And he talks about those who are anti-racist. And I like to think that all of us here are in that, in that school of thought and in that category. And then he talks about those who are more assimilationists, those who think that the problems and the discrimination in our communities, the racism in our communities stays not only in the failure of the state, but also in the way that Roma communities or other oppressed communities respond to their realities. And then, of course, the third category is more like the racists, those who are segregationists. And that's a category which we find very often, especially in our interactions with non-Roma scholars. And I think that Lela and I have had these conversations like so many times about what does it mean to be a Roma scholar? What does it mean to be a scholar of color in the space of power that is very much led by white scholarship and by whiteness, but white ideology. So in that space, I think it's important we start a conversation, we challenge, we provoke, but I think it's much more out there to unpack. And it comes to mind some of my conversations with non-Roma scholars. Recently, I was talking to this scholar, in thinking about publishing a piece, and this Gadget told me that, I think that in this piece we have to be more balanced. We have to make sure that we are not how did he call it? That we are not making demands. This has to be a balanced piece. And to me, it's like, oh, I see you. I see what you mean. You have the you have the the flexibility, and you can be in the place where you when you mean when you say balance, you actually mean soft. It means that you speak the language of the institution. So there is this code language that we see in the way that white scholars, some of the white scholars address us. And I think that Nidhi and I are talking about about this in the chapter quite a bit. And I'll perhaps we can continue later, but I'll stop with perhaps another point that we discussed there, and it's really the idea of solidarity, and is the solidarity amongst the oppressed. Suraj and I met years ago at Harvard, and I think that listening to him and talking about Dalit people, it was just impressive, but at the same time, it felt like some of of the issues that he talked about felt like so close to the issues that we experience in our Roma communities. And I think that this is really a topic that we see very often when we speak with other people of color. So the idea of oppression, being it racism or caste or other system of oppression, is there. And I think that we have to look at similarities of oppressions, while recognizing the specificities of our histories, but at the same time trying to move ahead towards a path of solidarity. And this is what Suraj and Professor Cornel West and Carleen Griffiths and others at Harvard have done. So in our small, bubble of at Harvard, we are trying to implement solidarity. And in the chapter, Nidhi and I reflected a bit on that. So I'll stop, and I'm sorry, I think I've taken much more time.
Your bubble is spreading all over, I hope. Let's hope the bubble is spreading wider and creating further, bubbles across the world, actually, waves across the world. So now that's a great segue into Suraj. And Suraj, it's such an honor to have you here. And I'm just going to quickly read through your, extremely, your bio is just tremendous. So I'm so honored. Dr. Yengde, Suraj Yengde is one of India's leading public intellectuals and a noted scholar of caste. He is the author of the bestseller Caste Matters and co-editor of award-winning anthology The Radical in Ambedkar. Caste Matters was recently featured in the prestigious Best Nonfiction Books of the Decade by The Hindu, one of India's leading dailies. Suraj is a senior fellow at the Kennedy School and an inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability at Harvard. He has also studied in 4 continents, Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, and he's India's first Dalit PhD holder from an African university, the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Suraj is a published author in the field of caste, race, ethnicity studies, and interregional labor migration in the global South. He is developing a critical theory of Dalit and Black studies. Suraj has been nominated for India's highest literary award, the Sahitya Academy, and is a recipient of the Dr. Ambedkar Social Justice Award, which was awarded from Canada in 2019. And finally, he is the recipient of the Rohit Vemula Memorial Scholar Award in 2018, and he's actively involved in building solidarity between Dalit, Black, Roma, Indigenous, Buraku, and refugee peoples in the Fourth World Project of Marginalized Peoples. And I hope you can discuss that a little more, Suraj. And thank you so much for coming on board as discussant today.
No, thank you so much. I am deeply honored to be amidst all these wonderful, beautiful people whose deliberations have enriched me today. At the outset, allow me to extend my congratulations to Andrew, Marius, and Nidhi for the excellent collection that you have brought out. Policy Press, Bristol University has gotten this out, and I encourage everybody to peruse that important literature. As I was hearing deliberations, it goes from policy to organizing to a critique of a certain economic social order, which states itself in a neoliberal framework, but also how we re-envision the status of Europe as a provincial colony of its own making within the larger context of where we fit the most important constituency of that, the highly denigrated and historically oppressed people who underwent genocide and the vast tendencies of a Holocaust that is recently acknowledged. And congratulations in grief that we remember the sacrifices of the forebearers of the Roma community who have laid a path for these Roma people to now think and imagine. So congratulations on that, Lela, to you. And I come here mostly with the love and affection that is built on our shared sorrow, as well as our shared skin. It could be skin color, but skin is about rubbing of skin and working together with my dear sister, friend, and lover of the cause, Magda, who in her own might is a compassionate activist who has really opened up so many gates and doors for all of us, especially for people like me, to imagine myself as part of Roma humanity. And if I am in one of the Europe, I am basically a Roma. If you look at the historical developments of Roma existence, it's quite striking that you are me and I am you in a larger actual. So Telegraph did a DNA which kind of connected some of us to you guys, and I think that's the beauty of what comes around almost in circle, where I come as a Dalit, an outcasted, untouchable from India's most developed caste economy, to what we come to Europe in India, Europe's most developed color economy. And within this, we would like to break the bubble of these currencies of oppression so that you and I can actually rebuild a common humanity for all of people. The people who oppress us have lost humanity quite time ago. Now they just want to reproduce inhumane values. So there is nothing new. It's a plagiarization of the worst form. And in that, they really remiss much of the values that we offer so that their humanity can remain sane. And that's why, as a Dalit looking at this space, I just think about where and how can I be part of that. And I think it's very unfortunate that having grown in India, I very rarely at all, if was told or discussed about the Romani people and their struggle and their relation to my shared solidarity as well as the network of our connection based on oppression. It is, I think, in this light, I am very delighted to see that there are new avenues opening for us. And I would like to really propose, as mark of this occasion, that to organize a conference or a seminar so that more cultural exchange takes place between the Dalits from India, the tribal people, the indigenous people from India, and the Romani people, not only Europe, but across. So we really connect our ancestral feelings and as well as our upbringing in that light. When Lela was discussing about to really make Roma as a relevant category still in question in Europe, and that's shocking to many of us because the white regime works in a very wretched way, where a European immigrant who comes to America or North America gets immediately assimilated, and within 10 to 20 years becomes American all of a sudden by taking up the accents. But Roma people with several centuries of history, with credible presence, and of course contributing to richness of that continent as well as the culture and religious prospectors, yet have to stand in the line outside the door so they get recognized. This is a very shameful impact of what the brutal colonial masters have done upon themselves. And I think they never exported this issue to us, but we are glad that we are talking through a very modern neoliberal critique of how these policies that are constantly made. And I think one of the things, Magda, I would like to uplift your point about just not relying on policy as well as NGO-ized activism, but we need to really take power. And so some of our struggle back home in India is not to get into the door, but to own the house. And we would like to capture because it belongs to us. It belongs on our sweat, and our ancestors have built the foundation of it. But it's only obvious that their inheritors actually occupy and run the show. And I think we would like to shift that angle, and that angle could shift very well within available democratic frameworks, but also there are limitations to liberal democracy, as well as in today's context, what we have right-wing democracy operating in its various forms. So what do? Is we need to really question the political categories that are heaped upon us so that they're almost presented as a panacea to our problems. I have a huge, I have to learn a lot to pierce through those high towers and big walls behind which we are kept hidden through the global culture. Our basic, as I was learning more and more about Roma people, is our basic needs are extremely basic to any society: education, housing, healthcare. This is basic what we need. Also, the immense amount of drawback when it comes to education. The group that is most highly uneducated or remains illiterate in India is the Dalit population. Of the 100% Dalit, only 5 graduate with university degree. So if you are seeing me, I'm one of those lucky 5, and the rest 95 are doing manual labor, and majority of them are incarcerated in prison. The prison population is dominated by Dalits, Muslims, and as well as the tribal populations of India. So what we see, and there is a negative stereotype attached to our identity. So I'm ashamed, Lela, to your point, that people are ashamed to own up their Roma identity. It really hit me, and it really is something we need to subvert and add beautification, not the prejudicial, stereotypical beautification interpreted by white man, or in our case, the Brahmins. We would like to beautify ourselves through our grandmothers and grandfathers' experiences, but as well as their skin tone and their skin color is what makes us unique. And I think it is in this light, I am very pleased that I will continue to closely keep watch on what great things you are doing and how you are struggling and how you are fighting. Make sure and be aware that as you do, Dalits are also watching you. So you're not alone in this. We have a huge constituency of 290 million Dalits. We can eat Europe for a breakfast if we decide to. This is how big we are. So let's have more connected conversations if we do that. And also, we will be always following the great leads and leaderships of the excellent women and men folk who I really call my own. I really thank you for inviting me. I am grateful. And as I said, I am enriched for today's conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Suraj, for those really warm words and really uplifting and critical analysis. And I have to say that it was such a pleasure to listen to you. It's my first time, so I'm very honored to have you on this panel. And we have a bunch of questions, actually. And Suraj, can you stay back for a bit? Because maybe some of the questions you can also address. But one of the first questions is actually for Magda. So shall we go right into the question, the Q&A? Is that good for everybody? Okay. Magda, this is for you. In your work, have you been able to partner with Black Lives Matter to enhance your solidarity work in the US?
Yes, I will answer this question, but I hope that Suraj joins me in answering, because I think that in many ways our paths are connected in addressing this topic. And I'd like to start by saying that very often in Europe, we think about racism as being an American product, an American reality, an American idea. But I think that too often, or most often, we forget that racism was born in Europe. Racism was born in Europe not only through the theories of race that were developed in the 19th century, but racist ideas or proto-racist ideas were born in Europe back in the times of the antiquity, starting with Aristotle and other philosophers who justified slavery of others. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that when the colonization of the United States was produced, colonization didn't mean only violence and killings of the Native Americans, but also meant a transfer of ideas, especially racist ideas, from one continent to the other. So I think it's important to acknowledge that reality, and to make sure that in Europe we just don't dismiss race and racism as topics, thinking that after the Holocaust we gave up that idea. We didn't. The reality is as pressing as it was 50 years ago. Is just that we don't recognize it, and scholars don't work as much on it. And I think that perhaps in this mind, in this having in mind these ideas, I really got a lot of interest to work and to understand better the struggles of Black Americans. And years ago, I reached out to Carleen Griffiths, who is one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter movement in Boston, and who eventually became one of our friends. And in this bubble of solidarity at Harvard, she's also a PhD at Harvard. And I think that with Carleen, when we started to discuss, what we aimed for was to create friendships, and to create a friendship not only between the two of us as women of color, as sisters, but also to create a friendship between our movements. And to us, that meant that we would start in a small place in which we start to learn about the history, the struggles, the realities and the tactics of protest, and then to move it forward. So I think that at least in the past 4 or 5 years, you would see that in many of the conversations that we created using the Harvard umbrella, you see Carleen interacting in these conversations with Dalit scholars, with Roma scholars, Palestinian scholars, but also activists and so on. So we've started to build that seed of friendship between our movements. But I think that this year perhaps has been much more powerful in terms of protesting and in terms of raising a voice, which is very much pushed or born from struggle, from pain, from the killing, the lynching of George Floyd. And being in Boston, both Suraj and I tried to help, and not necessarily to help, but to assist Black Lives Matter and the movement in protesting. I was volunteering, just offering my support to Carlene and the other leaders, and my help was from trying to identify students at Harvard who would help with health issues during the protest, to being a marshal at the protest, and giving bottles of water to the participants and so on. So I felt that I was there in a small capacity assisting, and I think that was the best I could do at that moment. I think assisting Carlene and the others was my role, but it's not enough. I think that both Suraj and I are there for the leaders that we know. It's obvious that we don't engage much with Black Lives Matter leaders in other cities, but in Boston, when I'm needed, I'm definitely offer my help, and my help can be very humble in many ways, and I give it with all my heart.
And Magda, we were so worried that you were going to get COVID. I remember you were running around in the streets and getting dehydrated also yourself. So you were really in the trenches, and my hat's off to you and Suraj for that solidarity. And one of the things that we were discussing with Marius and Andrew also is the inspiration that Black Lives Matter has been for the European Roma activists. And especially, I remember there was something that the group in Czech Republic, the Czech Romani activists, had really written some stuff about direct impact on how they would maybe use some of the same strategies and tools that BLM is using in the US, and activate the community there. So it's been an inspiration that way as well. And we have another quick question from a panelist, and this is someone from Bulgaria, Genoveva Sotirova, and she is asking that about effective legal help from the advocacy perspective in Bulgaria. That what kind of legal assistance Roma can access in Bulgaria, and why it's not effective. So this is her question, and I want to pose this maybe to Marius and Magda as well. What do you guys think? Because I know, Magda, we've been talking about the advocacy, strategy with legal litigation, but how that hasn't been always very effective. So, but can you please give your thoughts on that? Maybe Marius, do you want to start?
Yeah, actually, the question, it's a little bit more complex. And I will pick up on the institutional races, on what Magda said at the beginning, that even at the Ivy League, in the top of the top, still you have kind of a, let's call it institutional resistance, till the example given by Suraj that the systemic barrier and actually streaming of the poor and of the minority towards the carceral system. It seems that it's the same in America. It seems that the same in India. But I think it's a little bit more complex, and I think the answer to our friend from Bulgaria is that the institution resistance, this is actually what makes more difficult to fight the races. So unless you unveil the mechanism of the institutions that excludes you, that actually it's used the racialization, the racial politics to exclude you, you won't go to the same institution to defend you. So in other words, what I'm there, it's going back to the example of Magda. So this is kind of a post-colonial thing in the academia. When the people wants your blackness, but they want the spirit and the approaches to be white. So in other words, they want to color the picture. Baba, Homi Baba, it has this expression of mimicry behavior. Yeah? So the institution accepts you to color the picture, but otherwise you have to talk their language, to use their vernacular, and to be obedient with the rules. As much you challenge and you try to put your point of view, you will be pushed down. And this is one type of institutional racism. Another type, it is when the young people try to break through the institution. And if you look at the job market, you will see the majority of jobs open allegedly for Roma. It's either intern or very junior people. This is embedded into what it's called the post-colonial approaches of coloring the picture but not reforming the institution. In regard with litigation and legal mechanisms that we have here in Europe, my personal opinion is that it's one way to follow, but to my sense, it's too long time consuming and inefficient. So, and I'm taking the example of school desegregation process. For the last 15 years, we try to play the card of litigation at the local level, national level, and almost for a decade, we have more than a decade, we have a case in European Court of Human Rights where the Czech Republic on Ostrava case, it has been found guilty by the European Court of Human Rights. But this process of 15 years, it didn't bring any visible changes at the local level. So to my sense, starting and playing the litigation card, it's a beginning. But if we don't have community organized, what Magda mentioned in her talk, the way how Marshall Gantz or other people that work with the community, and here it's touching upon a little bit on what Suraj also said. So we need to have what Freire said, the pedagogy of oppressed, rewritten, and how this type of pedagogy, it brings solidarity among the oppressed. How we go in parallel with the litigation card. So I'm not saying that litigation is not good, but definitely we have to pair it with some more actions, with some other approaches to go together once the discrimination process it's identified by the court. We have to have set of actions that will bring the real institutional changes and will stop in a way or another the exclusion and the discriminatory practices. Otherwise, we'll have just, I'll call it Pyrrhic victory, you know?
If I can add to that. Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you very much for this conversation. It's very enlightening. There are some quotes that I really liked of what was said. So I will just follow up on what Suraj said. Our challenge is not to get our foot into the door, but to own the house. And I just want to say that really resonated with me. I want to print it on a t-shirt. But I feel like it kind of comes back to these questions. And then, you know, what Marius talked about, people want your blackness, but they don't want your voice, which I think is something that I very often see, you know, when we talk about what's happening, particularly in the Romani community, just to follow up, I feel like, and that's something I also mentioned in the book, right? Are we challenging Gajo supremacy in our work, or are we upholding it and reproducing it? You know, and think the questions, is that for me, like a lot of that challenging the Gajo supremacy is very intrinsic to the Roma community, because amongst ourselves, we are very proud and honorous, and, you know, we do challenge it, right? We don't mingle, we stay amongst ourselves very often. But when we are in the Gajo world, it seems like we are still staying in that power structure where we are, you know, trying to cater to those needs, trying to not, you know, upset the Gajo. And so I think that very often, if you go back to the communities, there is that sense, that profound sense of challenging the Gajo supremacy. But very often when we enter, you know, the systems of oppression that hurt us, we end up reproducing them because we're thankful to be there. And it has a cost, right? Challenging Gajo supremacy comes with a cost. Even amongst this quote unquote liberal allies, you know, who want to help the Roma, when you come in and you challenge their work, you are seen as a threat. And so for me, coming back to the question of the movement of Black Lives Matter or other solidarities building, I think that if I look at Indigenous scholars and Black scholars in challenging white supremacy, right, that has been extremely inspirational to my thoughts, but it has been also really important for myself. And I think for the works of very many other Romani people, seeing what's going on and how other people are movementing and challenging. And especially right now, you know, I've seen that, like, after what happened to George Floyd, for example, the European Roma Rights Center started, you know, doing some stories on police brutality towards the Roma. I mean, police brutality towards the Roma is nothing new. It's something that we're so used to, so that, like, to the point that I myself, when I'm driving with my child, I mean, I've been taught, like, be careful, the police is there, right? And that's something that we're all taught, to be scared of the police from, you know, our youngest age. So I think that seeing what's going on, you know, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, allows us today to question it. It gives us a hope to kind of be fighting it back. And it's not, let me be clear, it's not thanks to the white people that we're fighting it back. It's thanks to the solidarities that we're building with other racialized communities who are fighting it as well. So it's extremely important to recognize that and to build more solidarity. And I will end it there.
Thank you. And Suraj, did you want to go next quickly? Because I know you're running out of time. You have another talk at the Pritzker Center, which is about, you know, Dalit mobilization and Dalit social justice. I think it's a conversation with Philip. Okay, someone has just posted it, I think, or yes, at the Pulitzer Center. Sorry, Pulitzer Center. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you. I just wanted to honor and convey, you know, one of the things is on the Black Lives Matter question is because of the American imperialism, the protest against it, especially like our professor Cornel West talks about, because they are in the belly of the beast, they get more recognition and more attention to their struggle. But also, I think what we need to pay attention to is that the struggle or the way to look at the struggle happening in America, we also need to look at each other's. What that means is, let it not be Americanized form of protest as well. There could be inspirations, but there are also various other forms which are native and indigenous to our cultural protest. It need not be the necessary hashtag emulation, but there are some certain things that needs to be communicative. For example, what happens in Dalit world, the world doesn't know. What happened in Romani world, the world doesn't know. What happens in America, the world does know. So I think there is a certain question of solidarity that we need to be critical about, because even, you know, like Magda was doing this summer, the work, I was also, you know, I was doing domestic work. I was taking care of the kids and, you know, spending time, because the revolutionary woman folks is the movement where there and their kids are young, and, you know, but in the broader consensus, I think we need to also de-Americanize our sensibility, the way we approach, and not necessarily reject that. But I think there are various ways that there are solidarities that not always doesn't need to look across the Atlantic, but they could be perhaps that side of the ocean, which need not necessarily, you know, forget of the historicity. And I think that is how, because every time where I go, I'm asked the same question. And I appreciate that, and we are in solidarity. We every year we do that solidarity, and then we work together. But also there is limitation to that, because the canon and the armaments of protest in America is different to our own experiences. It might not necessarily emulate. We don't have as robust of a media that can tell to the rest of the world this is what's happening. And if they chose, then they can telecast it for a week or 2 weeks. You know what I mean? So those are some of the limitations we have in our space. Having said that, solidarity also needs to be convergent. It just not to be one way. It just not be, and then that's one of my, critiques of, the earlier generations as to why it was always one way, why it was not always the other way as well. And then, the reason I say that is because let our younger generation not get swayed by the attraction of this American dream or the bubble of this protest. There are various ways we can dialogue, and their dialogues can be lateral, but also there can be something which could speak from our own unique vantage point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suraj. Thank you. Are you taking off now, or do you have to go?
Yeah, unfortunately,
Okay.
they've been sending me messages as to where are you, and I said, okay,
Okay.
let me go.
So I'll just end with a little bit of something from India. Aap alvida mat kehna. Kabhi alvida na kehna.
I will never say alvida. I will never say goodbye. We'll always be
Okay,
there.
don't say, that means don't ever say goodbye. Okay, take care.
I'll take care, right? Love you all. Stay
Thank you.
strong.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. So Magda, would you like to add a few things about Bulgaria or specifics?
Yes, I would like to. I'm still trying to process some of the things that have been said. Very, very powerful conversation. But perhaps getting back to Genoveva's question about Bulgaria and legal help, I'm very grateful to Genoveva for asking this question, because I believe that anti-Roma racism has been a reality for centuries in Bulgaria as much as in many other countries in Europe, and more so, I think, since 2017. In an environment of populism, especially led by politicians and representatives of government and parliament. I think it's particularly complicated for Bulgarian Roma, and is much more complicated also in times of COVID, when some of the measures that are taking against Roma people in Bulgaria are very much reminders of the measures that were taken in the 30s and 40s during the typhus epidemic in Bulgaria, which are basically anti-Roma measures, violence, roadblocks, segregation, in the name of public safety. So I think this is a dangerous path, and it's really a reality in Bulgaria. And perhaps being pragmatic about it, and looking more at the practice, I think that it's important to continue on this path of litigation, and to have lawyers, pro bono lawyers, non-Roma lawyers who join our fight and who challenge in courts these behaviors, these attitudes, and more so the actions of the governments and local governments. So once again, following this path of activism and courts, I think it continues to be relevant, and more so in situations like this. But I think that very often, and we talk about this quite a lot in the chapter, Nidhi, very often the challenges that Roma face in Europe, being it in Romania, in Kosovo, in Serbia, in the Czech Republic, most often these challenges are not just individual cases of violations of human rights. Very often these challenges are collective. These challenges affect a large portion of Roma people. segregation in education in the Czech Republic does not affect one individual or 17 individuals who file a complaint before the European Court, but it affects a large portion of Romani children placed in special schools. So I think that one of the points that we make in the book is really this idea that in the case of collective injustices, we need collective remedies and collective answers and collective justice. And therefore, perhaps getting back to the first conversation that Andrew suggested, I think that in thinking about a social Europe, we do have to look at of redistribution, but also social justice and interventions. And when we talk about interventions, I think that reparations is really a must. And we talk about this in the book a bit, but it's been also a topic that we've been trying through the Roma program to push in the past 5 years, actually proposing ways to ensure reparations, not only for past injustices like the slavery or the Holocaust or the big gypsy roundup in Serbia, in Spain, but also for present day collective violations of rights, including a segregation of Roman children in special schools. So I think that that's a conversation that we need in the movement, and that it requires much more courage. So I think, moving back again to this idea of what is our role as Roma scholars and activists, I do think that we need to be courageous. I don't think, as Lela said, we don't have to continue to work in this Gage paradigm. We really need to, to ask what we want. We don't have to be balanced. We don't have to be, soft. We don't have to be careful in the way in which we challenge a Gage world, because the lives of Roma people are at stake. So for us, it's important. It's not just a matter of intellectual curiosity. It's a matter of making a world that fits, the Roma in an equal and a dignified way. So I do, believe that we need more courage on both sides, scholars and activists, and also journalists.
And Magda, that's a great segue into a question, and you've already partially answered that. So this is a question by Vijay Ganju. What would you like to see done in the next 10 years? What kind of changes, what would need to be done? And this, by the way, is also connected to this new EU Roma framework, which is supposedly, 2020 to 2030. This is exactly 10 years. And I know many of us are a little cynical about it, given that, the past record hasn't, resulted in anything, tangible or concrete, or nothing in a big way. Let's say there have been small successes on the ground, some desegregation successes. But I would say this is like an open panel question, and we may only have time for this and perhaps one more. I'll just add it to the mix real quick. So this is about, this is from Joanna Koska. A lot of my students are white and very interested in anti-racist movements. Is there a better way to build solidarity with white people, especially those in the younger generation who don't particularly have positions of power in the younger generation? Okay, so if we can combine what is to be done in the next 10 years, and then how to build solidarity with young white folks. This is a quick question for the whole panel. Thank you. Lela, do you wanna, or does Marius want to start?
Yeah, I might take this up. And thank you, Magda, for raising the issue of reparation. But this was my point when I said that the current way how the litigation is just acknowledging the discriminatory act, and the reparation, sometimes it's ending up with a couple of thousands of euros. But the mechanism of segregating kids into the school, or the institutional setup that will continue the discriminatory act, it's unchallenged. Maybe when we think the package of reparation would be how, in a way to another, to alleviate the institutional effects, and how to work with the institution that the discriminatory act will stop when it's identified, and also the reparatory measures should be a full package rather than very tokenistic reparation with couple of thousands of euro. And maybe we will think of the trauma that those children suffer there as an act of discrimination and segregation in a school. How effectively they will be re-putted in a quality system education, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about the reparation, shouldn't be like it was up to now. Yes, the European Court of Human Rights is imposing to the state some pecuniary things. Now, what we have to do in the next 10 years, definitely, we have to continue to work with the institutional setup and to challenge it as it is now. We have to be in dialogue with politicians, with practitioners, and with the academics, and to strive to continue to put the Roma issues on the public agenda. Of course, that we need allies. And our brothers and sisters, the white people, have been demonstrated historically. Mahatma Gandhi wouldn't reach his victory, and he wouldn't have such a revolutionary movement if he wouldn't have the support of the white. There are people into some political sphere that by default they can contribute into our movement. Indeed, it's our movement, but other people could join. The curiosity of students, it's normal. And I think it's in a way or another the merit of the Black Lives Matters movement and other movements. And the way how the visibility, sometimes through the symbolic violence, sometimes with the street protest, it's awakening some of the students to understand more about the racial discrimination. And I also have to confess that some of my students, they are more curious about this. So once you tell your stories, I'm pretty sure that a lot of white people will ally and will join the efforts of the racialized community, regardless they are Roma, Dalits, Afro-Americans, and other racialized and excluded communities, including LGBTQI. So solidarity, it's a human feeling, and I think we all the time will have allies, but also enemies into the white community and larger community.
If I may just add to that, I don't know if I can, just very quickly, because I think it's a very important point about solidarity. Yes, solidarity, but let's just remember that sometimes the curiosity also comes, I'm sorry, from a white savior industrial complex. And I want us to think about, you know, ways in which allyship can be done. And like very often it's very performative, but how can you, I think the question, like there's a lot of people who come up to me every day when I mention I'm Roma, oh my God, I want to know more. It's great that you want to know more, but the question is, and like, let's not forget that, you know, once you start joining Roma studies, you will definitely get a lot more visibility, because there's not a lot that's being done. So I think that for me, like the main thing that I want to answer to that is like, how can you use your privilege as a non-Roma person to uphold the voices of the Roma people and not just continue reproducing systems of power and oppression through your own interest and curiosity, which I think is something that's very seldom addressed. So that would be my last point. And just as I've written, Ronald Lee, when he very much, and I talked about this, and he said one thing which I think resonates very well to me. He said the decade of Roma inclusion was actually the decade of Roma exclusion, and talking about actually that space that the Gajo hold, centering the voices of the Roma. So I think that curiosity is great, but remember your place, I'm sorry to say. And, remember your positionality in addressing that curiosity and where does it come from? So that would be my last word.
Andrew, did you want to say anything closing? Because I have a couple of I wanted to say thank you.
Just a very small thing. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'd like to see it continue actually next year. And Suraj expressed this interest in the Dalits and the Roma. Of course, we co-edited a volume on the Dalits and the Roma for the Indian Journal of Social Work, a volume entitled Collectivity and Empowerment in Addressing Marginality, the Roma and the Subaltern Communities of India. I would be very interested in the seminar discussion next year on this topic. And we could upload to any kind of Facebook page all the contributions to the journal and make it open access and have a very, very interesting discussion with everyone who's here today and others. So I would be well up for that, say next February, but that's just something for the future. But I think that could be a really important outcome of today. It's something we've been working on, and many of us, for a number of years. And we want others to come in and join us in this work and take it further. Yeah, and I felt there was a very positive discussion today. And I think that's very valuable as well. In this difficult time, we're remaining positive and focused. And there's a plan. That's all I have to say.
Magda, did you want to say something? And then I'd like to go ahead and close. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I do want to thank everybody, but yeah, sorry, go ahead, Magda.
Okay, thank you so much. A couple of things. First of all, I think that in discussing reparations, I do want to underline that to me, reparations does not mean compensations, financial compensations, and it's definitely not something that the European Court provides. The European Court mostly deals with damages, but reparations in the way that Jackie, Baba, and I think about it in proposing, mechanisms and tactics of response include truth-telling, memorialization, acknowledgement, of financial compensations too, apologies, but also offender accountability. And I think that this idea of offender accountability really it's something that we need to think about in discussing school segregation, because I think that Romani children who are placed in special schools do need to have that conversation, if you want that discussions with teachers and school leadership and institutions who are taking such decisions that influence dramatically their lives. And there is a need to have accountability for teachers and everyone else. Then on the issue of what can be done, I think that if we were to list a few steps, I think that reparations, in the way that I think about it, it's a must, not only in terms of ensuring equality and justice, historical justice, but also in order to diminish the wealth gap that is a product of centuries of oppression, and more so in Romania is a product of centuries of exploitation and free labor of Romani slaves for 500 years. In terms of what non-Roma can do and anti-racism, I think that there is a book which I keep here with me, which is written by Ibram Kendi, and who provides some suggestions about what it means to be anti-racist and how we can contribute. And I agree with Lela and Marius that anti-Roma racism is not only an issue that Roma scholars and Roma activists have to work on, but I think there is a lot that non-Roma can do. And what they can do mostly is really to work with the people around them, with the non-Roma around them, with the institutions around them, and challenge the structural racist structures that we are part of. So I think it's an important role to play, because I think that whatever happens to Roma in Europe and in the Americas is not a problem of the Roma, it's racism, and that needs to be challenged and changed by Gage too. So there is a role to play, and there are some ways in which I think can be, suggests that people get involved. There was a question about philosophers, and I think that, my teaching instinct gets activated, and I do want to suggest to the person, I think it was Andrew who asked, to look at Immanuel's Kant work, especially a piece that is called On the Different Races of Human Beings, in which Kant discusses four races, but then he thinks that whites and blacks were the two basic races, and then he believed in the superiority of whites. If you want to look at the work of philosophers in antiquity, I suggest you read Philosophers on Race, Critic Essays, which was edited by Julia Ward and Tommy Lott, and there is much more to look into this. Benjamin Isaac wrote about proto-racism in antiquity. Ibram Kendi speaks about racist ideas or proto-racist ideas in his book Stamped from the Beginning. There is a lot to say about it. And finally, I think that on the topic of anti-Gypsism, and I didn't want to take time on this, Marius, but I think that is for us, those who critique the term anti-Gypsism, for us is not just a matter of semantics, it's really a matter of how we think about policies. The moment we say that anti-Gypsism, as the European Commission likes to think that anti-Gypsism is prejudice and stereotypes, then we forget the experience of historical injustice. We forget the present day racism. We forget institutional racism. And it's not just about that. I think that the moment when we think about anti-Gypsism and to propose it, and I see that Orhan Gayus, for instance, is here, and he has, he has questioned new concepts lately quite a bit. I think that we do propose that Roma are not Roma. We propose that Roma are Gypsies, and that's dangerous. We are going back like 50 years ago when we are talking about who we are. So the question of who we are now is becoming as relevant as it was 50 years ago. So in many ways, Roma scholars and more so politicians and activists, they are forgetting the history, which is written now. So, the past 50 years have been written.
Thank you, Magda. And that's absolutely correct. I mean, it's not just about the Holocaust history, but even the history of slavery, going back to Moldavia, Wallachia is also starting to be written. And so many, people in different regions of Europe are writing the local histories and contributions of Roma, whether it's Bulgaria, whether it's Romania, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's France. So there's a lot of work being done, which is unfortunately unacknowledged. And I do want to, on that note, segue into acknowledgements. So thank you, Lela, Savic, from logging in all the way from Quebec, and Marius from the UK, Andrew from Hungary, and Magda from Harvard, from Boston, and Emma Peterson. And I want to thank all the guests here. And I do want to just give one little acknowledgement very quickly. So I wanted to thank Hannah Winnick, who's now with the Obama Foundation, for her assistance in the end of 2019 for the microgrant we received, which has made this book paperback, which is incredible because it's very rare that a book on Roma is in paperback. And the other thing is that it's going to be open source. So we really hope, like we did today, I think we had a really amazing discussion today, and I want to thank everybody. And one of the other persons I did want to thank in closing is Bastian Hermansen, who's the director of the foundation, the Böll Foundation in DC, and Emma Peterson today, and Carl for their technical assistance, without whom this webinar wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much, everybody. And I do want to once again encourage everyone to read the book. We have raised a lot of critical thoughts, provocative thoughts, just like Magda has reiterated, and that was our intention. And thanks once again to my co-editors, Andrew and Marius, for a job well done. And during this COVID time, again, very difficult. And thanks for pushing me. We really got, we got on each other's nerves at some points, but I think it was well worth it. So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye everyone.
Bye.
you.
Bye, Lela.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.